If Ronald Reagan hadn't entered the primaries against President Ford, do you think the outcome would have been different in November of 1976?
It's hard to say. I think it would have been better, and Ford, it ended up that Ford just barely lost.
Yes.
At the time we're taping this, Dole is way behind Clinton, but not as far behind as Ford was behind Carter at a comparable period. And that closed up very quickly, and lots of people say that if the campaign had lasted another week, Ford would have won.
Looking back at the Ford presidency, what kind of president was Jerry Ford?
Well, I think he was an ideal president for the time, under the circumstances that we had. Somebody that people liked and trusted. There was a lot of cynicism about government at that time. The Watergate was a very traumatic experience for the country, one that we still haven't recovered from. We're still recovering from it. And I think in so many respects, Jerry Ford was just the ideal president.
You perhaps came fairly close to being appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, in a sense. Once while Jerry Ford was president, and once afterward, had he been elected president. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, of course, there was the vacancy that developed when Douglas resigned. And the question was, who should Jerry Ford appoint with the election coming up? And, what goes around comes around. I told Jerry Ford I didn't think it was time to appoint a crony.
Harkening back to the good old days of Abe Fortas.
That's right.
Right.
That it was bound to be controversial. Even though I had lots of friends in the Senate, just the fact that he would appoint somebody as close to him as I was would be seized upon, I'm sure, and made controversial. He leaned very heavily on Attorney General Levy, who made a recommendation and came up with the Paul Stevens. And at that time, he was a very non-controversial appointee who went through and may not have helped Jerry Ford in his campaign, but didn't hurt him.
A lot of people have said that had Gerald Ford been reelected or elected in 1976, that you would have, in fact, been appointed to the next Supreme Court vacancy. Do you believe that probably was the case?
Well, it's pure speculation, obviously.
But if you were to speculate, you'd speculate yes.
I think that the loss by Jerry Ford affected me in a variety of ways. The other way, which you're probably going to ask about too, is the leadership of the Senate. I think the fact that Jerry Ford lost made a difference in terms of my standing and stature, or whatever you want to call it, in the Senate at that time. Not much, but just a little.
And that's all it took.
That's all it took.
Because you had defeated Howard Baker before by 2 votes, and this time?
This time I lost
by one vote.
Right.
For the leader's position.
Right.
You decided then sometime after that that you would not seek re-election to a third full term in the Senate, even though you were still really quite young, 54, 55. Why did you decide to get out of the Senate?
We get back to this thing of term limits, doesn't it? Not necessarily imposed term limits, but the natural rhythm of things. And after 12 years in the Senate, I started to, and having lost the leadership battle, I started to talk to myself about, do I want to spend the rest of my life in the Senate? One of the problems that, especially a senator from a state like Michigan, which is closely divided politically, is the terrible burden of raising the large amounts of funds that you have to raise to run. It's just, and running back and forth all the time, trying to keep 9 million people, more than that, satisfied, so that you've spoken to their group enough. And there's no question that there's a burnout that finally develops. And I guess I must say that I was burned out. And I came to the conclusion that I'd like to spend more time with my family. There might be other things that I would like to do besides serving in the Senate, which I enjoyed. And there came a point where I made the decision to not to run, and I announced it. And I guess one of the big mistakes I made later on was to change my mind and to try to run anyway.
Why did you change your mind?
Well, certainly a part of it was that I had people from the Republican Party who thought that it would be much better for the ticket if I were running, and would I run again. But I also had time, you know. After time, you get over the problems that you had of burnout and so forth, and you start to look at things from a longer perspective. And I guess I really did finally come to the conclusion that I had made a mistake and that I should have run. But it was a mistake to change my mind because it was too late then. Right. And the media wouldn't accept that.
Right, yes. And in fact, you got back into the race when? Was it April, somewhere in there?
It was pretty late, and a lot of money to raise.
Right.
And so it didn't work.
Right. Do you think, and of course I know this is idle speculation, but do you think had you gotten in the race in the first place and stayed there that it would have made an appreciable difference in the outcome that fall?
Well, I like to think so.
Yes.
I like to think that if I started early and organized a good campaign, that I could have won again. Right. Yes, I think so.
At the end of 1978, you left the Senate, but the call of politics came back again in 1982, and you ran for the state Supreme Court. Who encouraged you to make that run?
There's a guy named Spence Abraham, I think, was party chairman, and but I also always have had, obviously, interest in the judiciary. And as a lawyer, you know, the pinnacle of success in the profession is to be on the court. So I was always interested. I was doing well in the law business, but somehow or other I yearned for getting back into public service. I always enjoyed public service. I like to do what you think is right rather than being the hired gun for one side or the other, you know. And so I was talked into it, and I was glad to do it. As it turned out, I ended up having to run against Patty Boyle. At first, when I got into the race, it didn't look as though that would be the case. But for some reasons that are rather complicated, it ended up that I had to run against Patty. She, with Soapy Williams' strong support, put on a terrific campaign, and she won. And as I look back on it now, you know, I'm kind of glad she won. She's a real good justice of the Supreme Court.
But 2 years later, you again were nominated,
run,
and you were victorious.
And Dennis Archer and I were running, along with about 18 others. You know, there was a strange situation that year because anybody could get on the ballot by going down to the secretary with one petition or something like that, and there were 22 candidates. And Dennis and I came out the top two, and I got on the Supreme Court and served for 8 years. A lot of people ask me, well, which do you like better? And I like them both. They're entirely different, the service, but the Supreme Court is a very challenging and I think satisfying way to go. I wrote 120 some odd opinions and dissents for the court. Worked very, very hard. I don't think I've ever worked any harder than I did for the Supreme Court. People don't realize the extent of the responsibility and the weight of the power that the Supreme Court has. A lot of people don't, even some lawyers. The Record Eagle editorialized before the last election that the 8 most powerful people in the state of Michigan are the governor and the 7 Supreme Court justices. And I think that's true, and yet people read their papers and they can't figure out who to vote for, which is really too bad. I want to make one more pitch about the Supreme Court and the election of the Supreme Court. I think one of the worst things that we have now is that it's bad enough when congressmen take PAC money, which is special interest money. But at least congressmen are supposed to know in advance what they're going to do. So it's not surprising that the groups that support their position would help to finance them. But a Supreme Court justice isn't supposed to say in advance how he's going to vote. And it seems to me that special interest PAC money has no place in Supreme Court races. And I've been preaching that for a long time, and I hope something